Welcome to the DroidDevCast, a podcast brought to you by the team at Esper, bringing you the latest news, thoughtful discussion, and insights into all things Android DevOps, and open source software development. I'm your host, Rin Oliver, Content Marketing Manager at Esper, and today I'm joined by Daniel Magnum, Senior Software Engineer at Upbound. We're here this week to dive into all things rapid prototyping. We'll also learn more about Daniel's thoughts on rapid prototyping for product managers, how prototyping can be used for customer enablement and success, and how improving the user experience translates directly to business success. To wrap up the show, we'll dive into Daniel's work at Upbound and discuss how his experiences have shaped the way that he approaches prototyping as a whole. So with that said, let's get started. Daniel, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thanks for having me on. I'm really excited that you're starting a podcast because I always appreciate hearing your thoughts, and it sounds like you've already got some good guests lined up. So I'm pretty honored to be one of the early ones.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's a super exciting lineup. I'm stoked about it. It's really cool, and I'm really happy for this opportunity.
Definitely.
So my first question is, how do you approach low-fidelity prototyping? If you're just trying to get a handle on your users' needs, going lo-fi is often seen as like the best approach to understanding the basic core fundamental needs of the user. So what are your thoughts behind that?
Yeah, so I think what you said there is a great point. Low fidelity is great. Just for context, most of the time, the prototypes that I'm making are either a system that I'm building for folks to interact with, or it's something like a command line interface. So that moves a little bit more away from your typical front end user interface programming. But I definitely take advantage of the ability to hide things behind abstraction. So a CLI, it's really straightforward, right? You have some commands that you can issue, and behind the scenes, the user isn't really aware of what happens. So you're really just trying to give them a feel for the experience, right? So a great example of that is Crossplane, the project I work on for my day job. It is built on top of Kubernetes, right? So you've got a whole distributed system behind there, and there's things being created on the API server. There may be things that are getting created on cloud providers, et cetera. But from a command line interface perspective, you can kind of just mock all that out, right? Because you're just saying, hey, I'm presenting this command to give me some information back. So I definitely think, starting from a lo-fi approach and say, hey, if you issued this command and got this information back and, let's imagine that's actually happening, then you can get a feel for the user experience folks want, and then you can kind of build that behind that interface you've presented. And then, speaking with limited knowledge to the kind of UI side of things, you can give that same sort of UX feel without necessarily having the most polished UI, right? So I think a big thing that I've heard from folks who work on UIs that I work with have said, the flow between screens or maybe, parts of screens is really important, right? So there's obviously all the great stuff, illustrations and that sort of thing, but those can kind of be deferred, right? What you really want to think about is how someone progresses through using an application or a system. And you can do that in an extremely lo-fi manner, right? Because you're just going from one thing to the next. And then you can kind of get some customer validation there and then build up the experience around it. And I've definitely seen that be really valuable, especially with early stage companies, right? Where you're trying to still determine, what the airplane's going to look like while you're flying it.
That makes a lot of sense. Perfect. And so when it comes to approaching rapid prototyping from that software architecture space, how do you see high fidelity prototyping come into play? Are there any tools of the trade that you would recommend to software developers that are having to mock up a functional, fully scoped solution for their front-end teams?
Yeah, so once again, I don't have a ton of front-end experience, but I do know that a lot of folks I work with use InDesign and Figma for more of that user interface perspective. So, with that kind of thing, you're getting to working with designers, of course. But in general, I think a good practice from the software side of things is just to always make use of existing libraries, right? So there's always the possibility that you're going to need to, achieve functionality outside of what an existing library presents. But when you're doing the prototyping, even if it is more of like a high fidelity experience that you're trying to present, you can get a lot of those high fidelity components. So once again, going back to CLI, there are countless CLI frameworks out there that are going to allow you to, have pretty colors show up in the terminal. They're going to allow you to have interactive prompts and that sort of thing. And it may be that they don't really fit the needs that you have, but you can give someone that really positive experience. And the same thing goes with, building front ends and that sort of thing. So I know, once again, speaking from my limited knowledge there, but there are countless, React component libraries, for instance, that allow you to put something together that looks really nice. And maybe it doesn't have your particular brand feel to it, but you can still give someone, what feels like a really slick professional experience, that kind of legitimizes what you're presenting to them, which is especially important, early on in a customer relationship, when you're setting those initial expectations about what they're going to get.
Absolutely. Yeah. And in some situations, delivering a prototype quickly rather than worrying about the quality of code really matters. So this approach has seen some pushback in recent years where production-ready code that's optimized for efficiency has taken a hit. And so by extension, that's led to a lot of tension between front-end and back-end software developers. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So for full transparency, Ren sent over some of these questions beforehand, and this was one that really stuck with me because there's this quote I really like, and I can't remember who actually said it, but it's a quote that's been around for a while. It's probably been attributed to many people, but it's not in the context of software development. I believe it's in the context of some political type of thing, and the quote is, "It's not a mistake to make an exception, it's to forget you made the exception." So I like to take that approach when it comes to software, especially when you're moving really quickly and potentially making sacrifices when it comes to code quality. It's not necessarily a wrong thing to do, right? So especially, once again, coming from a current situation of working for a fast moving startup, there are times where we need to get something out the door. And being someone who I'd consider myself really interested in code quality and understanding, the full design of something before implementing it, sometimes you have to make those trade-offs, and sometimes it's the right decision to make. But you have to record that, right? You have to have an issue that says, we made this trade-off. This may be something that we need to correct in the future, but we're going to come back to it. And you mark that, and you recognize and you say it out loud. I've made this trade-off, and I'm confident making it, but it is a trade-off, right? And so I think that's a big part of it. And then when it comes to interacting with other teams, it may be harder to express that trade-off. So working on open source kind of full time for my job, you can kind of look at this as, number one, I have a company who consumes the open source work that I do, and I communicate with teams there. But then also the general open source community is a lot of people that I need to communicate with when we make trade-offs or we move faster on something. So, there are software motivated ways to do that. So release notes, public mailing lists, Slack, et cetera, that allow you to, make it clear when you're making a trade-off or maybe sacrificing some quality for getting features in early. And so making sure to do that is really important. And to the extent that you can, making that codified, right? So saying that a good example of this is if you're writing a program in Go, you can have an internal package, which literally means this software cannot be consumed, from another package. So no one can depend on this software, but we're going to use it internally, right? So that's a great example of a very verbose codified signal that you can put out that, this may not be something you want to rely on here. And so there's kind of different facets that you can go through to make sure you're being transparent about the quality of something and whether someone can depend on it. Another thing that I wanted to touch on for this question is versioning, right? So a lot of people are familiar with semantic versioning, where you have patch releases, which are not adding new features or breaking anything. You can have minor releases, which are going to add new features, but it's going to be backwards compatible. And then you have major releases where you're saying, hey, this is a fork in the road. We're breaking functionality. So if you've used this software before and you're upgrading to a new major version, you may have a bad time if you don't understand all those changes that are coming. So that's, once again, another way where you can, strongly codify and signal when you've made those trade-offs.
Exactly. So if you say, we have made a breaking change and you have to proceed and figure out if you want to use this in production.
Exactly.
What would you say to those companies, particularly at a startup life, where they're trying to also move quickly and they want to get their code into production? How would you work that out for them?
Yeah, I'm going to be really honest here. I struggle with this quite a bit because it's really hard for me to say to someone, I would like for you to use this software, even though I know it's, not, people say production ready a lot. I don't really know that I love that term, because production readiness is kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy, in that, like, if something is used quite a bit in production, then it's production ready. So, but, just something that's early on, like beta software, let's say. And there's a lot of push, especially in open source projects, when you have this really broad signaling with your version. A big milestone is hitting version 1.0, right? So this is when we're making our first major commitment, where we're saying we will support this over time. It's possible we could have future versions that are breaking, but we will continue to support this one. Whereas when you're pre 1.0, you can say from minor release to minor release, we may break anything. And when you're in that stage, how do you get customer feedback when you're saying I may break this? Well, I think making easy on ramps onto using your software, where folks don't feel like they're too locked in, or there's not going to be huge costs of them switching. So, for instance, Crossplane, the open source project I work on, it manages infrastructure for folks on Kubernetes, and that's a pretty big thing, right? Managing infrastructure, it's a cost intensive thing, it's a time intensive thing, and your whole business kind of depends on it. So how can you get folks to start using software before it's quote unquote proven or production ready? Well, you can say, let's break off this greenfield application, or let's take this small microservice that may not be mission critical for you, but we're confident we can support, and let's use it there, and let's help you kind of grow into using this platform more, so you can build up that confidence, right? Because otherwise, how are you going to get to that production readiness? How are you going to have users who have tested things thoroughly, who have taken things through all the edge cases where you've seen the bugs come out that you couldn't have tested for? And so I think that there's really, just a relationship building process there in open source and, internally between teams, when you're having folks kind of like consume newer software.
Absolutely, which leads us very nicely into our next question. How can front-end teams and teams of contributors that might not often get to write code, that are contributing for the first time, not only make sure to write, what's classified as air quotes, clean code, air quotes, while also standing up for themselves in their valuable skill sets, and make sure that back-end engineers understand the scope of their work when it comes to creating usable prototypes? Because I feel like a lot of that gets classified as not really code, which we all know isn't true. Mm-hmm. Code is code.
Right.
Non-code contributions are super important, and every code contribution, particularly in open source, matters and makes a difference. So I really think that it's important to have people's skill sets valued for the code they're contributing. How can people get other engineers to understand the scope of their work, even though it may not be seen as, and again, I'm going to use air quotes, technical enough? Air quotes.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's a really important thing. And you alluded to in open source, especially, the only real initial connection you have with someone in open source is, opening a pull request or something like that. So there's not kind of like the anecdotal evidence a lot of times to see the value of those non-code contributions initially. Yet over time, it becomes very apparent. And especially if you establish relationships with those people, you begin to see, how important that is. So before I go too far into this, I want to give a really good example of this. So, there's non-code contributions, which are like docs updates and writing and that sort of thing. And those are super important. But I actually think while they may be undervalued in some communities, you're still getting kind of like that pull request flow of, like adding things to a code base a lot of times. And if you're not, at least it's, kind of like public facing usually. So those are obviously really important folks, and they do a lot of work. But even some folks who can fall even more behind the scenes is people doing kind of like organizing work, right? And once again, especially in open source, where there's not necessarily a governing company that's interested in things succeeding because they want to make money. There may be a lot of companies interested, and it may be hard to coordinate them. So in Kubernetes, for instance, where I spend quite a bit of time as well, there's someone named Laurie Apple, who is relatively newly kind of like a PM for SIG release in Kubernetes. And a lot of what she does is make sure that everyone else is able to make their code contributions. And in a way, she's having a larger impact than any one of us individuals who's, writing a new feature or something like that, because she's making sure all of those things are coming together to present a good product in the end. So that's all to say that there are some really important folks in the community, and their contributions should definitely be valued. Another thing that you kind of touched on in this question, which I've seen a bunch, is a bit of a disconnect for folks that are doing work that dictate what features are going to be required from the engineers, and the engineers actually implementing that. So primarily what I'm thinking of in that case is design folks. So, and when I say design, I mean more like software design in terms of they're designing user experiences that are backed by software rather than like marketing and that sort of thing, which also really important folks as well, which we could talk about. But talking about people designing kind of like user interfaces and that sort of thing. One thing that I found is really important is having good communication. And that could look like brown bags or something like that. But when a designer, for instance, designs a new feature that needs to be implemented, after an engineer implements that, kind of like having a knowledge transfer of saying, hey, you don't need to understand exactly what I did to implement this. And I don't necessarily need to know all the steps that went into the research to designing what this feature should look like. But let's have a little bit of knowledge transfer to talk about what kind of effort goes into different things. And then the next time that, someone's creating a feature or something, they can create it with the effort required from the other party in mind, right? So for instance, on the Upbound side, we have some user interface designers, and some of the user interface they design is dependent on features in open source crossplane that I work on. And frequently, maybe not as frequently, because I think we do a good job of this, but frequently in organizations, a designer will say, oh, it'd be really nice if we just change this thing around to look like this. And to them, it's a very small change in a UI or something like that. But the way things work, either in the actual code for the front end or, deeper down into the system level of it, that could be a pretty high magnitude change there. And being able to kind of give someone some intuition around how different changes affect both on, the engineer side to the designer and the designer to the engineer, I think can go a long way to smooth those kind of situations.
Absolutely, because while it may look like something as simple as make the button round,
right?
If they want the button to change color or do something when you click it or something like that, it's a whole bunch of code that you don't see unless you're actually working on it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. We're doing something similar to Esper. I'm actually working with somebody in Miro, and I've never used Miro up until my time at Esper to work through some wireframes, and it's actually been a really interesting process for me to go through and work with developers and help them out with verbiage and making sure that everything reads correctly and making sure that the customers have a good journey throughout the entire experience with the product, and being able to bring my writing skills to that has been really fun. So highly recommend that too. That's been a great tool to learn to use.
Yeah, that's one of the things I've seen, and I'm not super familiar with Miro. I've seen it kind of pop up in some different places, like on Twitter and that sort of thing. But I know there's kind of like a smudging of the difference between kind of like design and code on the front end. And I've seen, that lots of design tools now can actually output, whether it's HTML and CSS or maybe even some JavaScript. I think like Webflow does some of this, where like designers, like they're kind of becoming more of the same thing. And it's really cool to see tooling to allow that, because there's really no reason that someone should have to understand all of the parts of something that can be efficiently abstracted away from them. So I think that's definitely gone a long way to increasing productivity in a lot of organizations.
Absolutely. And switching gears a little bit, can you tell us a little bit more about your own career journey? What's led you to where you are now? How'd you get started? What's your background?
Yeah, for sure. So I don't know how far back we want to go, but I'll have to go decently far back because I haven't been in the industry that long. So I graduated from college about a year and a half ago, and I was always super interested in open source, kind of like going back to high school and that sort of thing, mostly because where I went to high school, there was not an emphasis whatsoever on computer science or programming really at all. And so the only kind of exposure I got was through open source projects and that sort of thing. And then in college, it was much more of, a formal computer science education. And one of the earlier projects I got involved with was some of the different ones in the HashiCorp ecosystem. So it's funny now because some folks view Upbound as kind of a competitor to HashiCorp, but anyway, back in school, I really enjoyed getting involved with some of the HashiCorp projects and writing different plugins for Terraform and that sort of thing. And I was also always interested in infrastructure. And I wasn't exactly sure how to bring those two things together, because a lot of the folks that I would kind of like interact with were traditionally like sysadmin type folks. Yet I was much more interested in writing code to kind of like automate some of the things that sysadmins do. Fortunately, that's kind of been a big movement, I'd say, with infrastructure as code, and then distributed systems such as Kubernetes. In fact, a lot of the folks that I work with upstream in Kubernetes formerly were sysadmins, and they kind of like transitioned into kind of like this pseudo infrastructure tools developer kind of role. So that's kind of always been my interest a little bit. And I think as I've progressed through, different open source projects and, started my career and that sort of thing, that I've wanted to go even like lower in the stack. I think that there is, we were just talking about with some of those design tools, that there's some really great efficient abstractions these days that allow you to kind of like move farther and farther away from what's actually happening on a computer, and actually do that quite nicely, right? And develop good solutions. And that's a great thing. I personally have sort of just it's something that I try to fight sometimes, a desire to just like know something at the most granular level, which can come into trouble when you're trying to do something like rapid prototyping, right? And so I found myself kind of like moving farther and farther down the stack. But right now I'd say I'm kind of like in the middle of it, working on distributed systems. So coming out of college, I worked for a software consulting company for a little bit. And that was basically just like transitioning between kind of like large enterprisey organizations and implementing things. And during that time, I had started to get involved with Crossplane, which was announced, I think, the week before I graduated from college at KubeCon Seattle in 2018. And I just started contributing as an open source person because I thought it was interesting. I also thought, like, oh, maybe I'll get in early on this and then it'll be big, and I'll be one of the more significant contributors. And then after doing that for about 6 months, just on nights, after work and on weekends and that sort of thing, Upbound, the company that started Crossplane, reached out and said, hey, it seems like you're interested in doing lots of work on this. Would you like to do this full time? And that was just over a year ago. I just had my 1-year anniversary at Upbound, and it's been awesome. It's definitely a different experience than some of the internships I had in college and my first job out of college, as those were both very like large company, kind of more enterprise facing. So yeah, that pretty much brings me to now. I'll say a big thing that kind of been tangential to my work on Crossplane and at Upbound is shortly after I joined Upbound, I started getting involved more intimately in the Kubernetes community, and first through the release team shadow process. So folks are not familiar, you can basically, for each Kubernetes release, there's a release team that's gathered and there's leads, and you can apply to be a shadow for a certain position on the release team. So I believe there's 6 teams right now on the release team. And shortly after I joined Upbound, I saw the application come out to be a shadow, and I applied for that, ended up getting it, and then did shadowing for 2 cycles. And this past cycle, I was the lead of the CI Signal team. And then this next cycle, I'm going to be shadowing again, but for the whole release team lead, who's going to be Jeremy Rickard this time around. So that should definitely be fun. And I've kind of dipped my toes into different parts of the Kubernetes ecosystem and all the different SIGs and different parts of the code base as I've been in the community longer. So, and I've met awesome people like you, which has been totally great, and definitely one of the great benefits, I'd say, of doing open source, because you just get exposed to people from all over the world with different backgrounds from you, different stories, different interests. And that's definitely been one of the most positive parts of my career so far.
Absolutely. I love everyone in the Kubernetes community. They're all wonderful. I just heard from Rob Kelty about being a shadow on the CI Signal team for the 1.20 release 2 for Kubernetes. Mm-hmm. And I can't actually do it right now, but I'm like, maybe next year I will do that. Yeah, I'm actually going to be involved starting in a couple days on the Google season of docs for Kubernetes. I'm going to be working on some of the contributor guide updates, so that's really cool. Excited about it.
That's great.
Yeah, it's super fun. And so, yeah, you have had a really fun career so far. So what's something you'd like to learn in the next year? Or is there anything you've previously struggled with that you'd like to pick back up? Going to do some quarantine bread baking or something?
Well, so I'll give a kind of like programming related one and a non-programming related one, which I'm not as prepared for the second one. So I'm hoping it's going to come to me while I'm doing the first one. But as far as programming related, which is probably my number one hobby as well, I mentioned that I've kind of been interested in like moving lower and lower down the stack. So I've been getting pretty interested in hardware and firmware. And so recently I've been getting some old computers and kind of like taking them apart and, looking at the motherboard and just trying random things with them. And one of the things that I really would like to do at some point, which there's, a fair amount of effort depending on what kind of trade-offs you're willing, I guess, to do. But I'd like to build a computer from scratch. And once again, that can mean a few different things. One of the best tutorials on this, I think, is by someone named Ben Eater. I believe he worked at Khan Academy for a while. So he's definitely been exposed to kind of like that teaching style. I don't know if folks have used Khan Academy, but I remember in high school and stuff that it was a big help to me. And he has this whole YouTube series and then these blog posts as well on how to build an 8-bit computer. And it's not all transistors, but it is all just integrated circuits and that sort of thing. I'm fairly certain. And it's a pretty large set of breadboards to be able to do that. But he gets to the point where you're basically able to program the thing. So it's a, Turing complete machine. And I think that is super cool. Balancing that with working at a startup and doing Kubernetes stuff is going to be a bit of a challenge, but that's definitely something I would really like to do. Another thing, I guess, on the non-programming side, I'm trying to think. Like I said, I spend like a little too much time on the computer, I think. So I probably should develop something outside of it. I like running a lot, but I don't really have any specific goals in that. One thing I will say is I got married about 3 weeks ago, so not too long ago.
Oh, congratulations!
And my wife is thank you. My wife is excellent at construction, which she's a very small person, so it's funny to kind of like see her build these like big structures and that sort of thing. But she's really good at construction, and good at woodworking and that sort of thing. I actually just got a new desk for my kind of home office, and she, on the other hand, is like building her own desk. So I just pale in comparison to her and all of these things. But, I had to loop this back to computer somehow. I'd like to build some of the actual like casing hardware if I was to be able to put together one of these like 8-bit computers or something like that out of, something I was made through woodworking. And there's an organization, I live in St. Louis, Missouri, and there's an organization here that is like a nonprofit, and they do a lot of workshops and fundraisers and that sort of thing. And they're based around kind of like crafting, I guess, but primarily woodworking. And they have a workshop, and you can buy a membership there and go in and you can use all of their tools, and they have pretty much everything you'd ever need. And then you can also take classes and that sort of thing. And we were doing that for a while because we have a membership there, but it's been, obviously less so since all the coronavirus stuff. But I definitely would like to get more into that and kind of develop that skill. But luckily I have someone who's already really excellent at it to teach me. So maybe we'll do a knowledge transfer, and my wife can teach me how to build actual things, and I can teach her how to build an application or something like that.
I love it. That's so awesome. That's so cool. We're hoping to join our local makerspace once we move. I'm really excited. And my wife and I, we really love the Glowforge. We're looking into getting one. I think they're awesome. And before we get too far off track about the Glowforge, I'm going to wrap things up for today. Daniel, thank you so much for joining me. Next week, I hope you'll all turn into the DroidDevCast. I'm joined by my friend Soren Hamby to talk about accessible UI and UX design, so that's going to be a wonderful show. Please remember to like and subscribe and listen to us on iTunes, SoundCloud, Simplecast, or wherever you get your podcasts from. Thank you for listening, and have a wonderful rest of your day.